Ouch, my toe.
When the horse steps on the toe, specialized mechanoreceptors like Meissner's corpuscles, Pacinian corpuscles, and muscle spindles are stimulated. These receptors respond to light touch, vibration, and conscious proprioception, which is the awareness of joint position and movement. These signals are carried by A-beta fibers from the skin and by group 1A and 1B fibers from muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs. These are large diameter, heavily myelinated axons which allow for fast and accurate transmission of information. The signal ascends ipsilaterally in the spinal cord through the fasciculus gracilis and synapses in the nucleus gracilis of the medulla. At this first synapse, the neurotransmitter glutamate is released, allowing the signal to continue. The second-order neuron then desiccates in the medulla and ascends to the ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus, where it synapses again. The third-order neuron projects to the primary somatosensory cortex. Along the way, the information is processed at the spinal cord, medulla, thalamus, and cortex, where fine touch and body position are consciously perceived. In this case, the DCML pathway allows the brain to detect the exact location of the foot, its position, and the intensity of pressure being applied by the horse.
Our next pathway is the spinothalamic, with the lateral portion carrying pain and temperature and the anterior carrying crude touch and pressure. The free nerve endings in the skin detect a noxious mechanical input, the crushing pain from the horse's hoof. There are A delta fibers for sharp pain and C fibers for dull pain or temperature. This signal travels through the anterior lateral column. It enters the spinal cord and immediately synapses at the dorsal horn. The primary neurotransmitters here are glutamate for fast pain and substance P for slow pain. The second-order neuron then decussates at the level of the spinal cord and ascends contralaterally to the VPL nucleus of the thalamus, where it synapses again. The third-order neuron projects to the primary somatosensory cortex. The signal is processed at the spinal cord, thalamus, and cortex, allowing the brain to consciously perceive sharp, localized pain, as well as crude touch and temperature changes if present. This is the main pathway that helps you recognize the intense, immediate pain of being stepped on. Next, we have the divergent pathways, which include spinoreticulator, spinolimbic, and spinomesencephalic, that carry slow aching pain and trigger emotional and autonomic responses. The C fibers in the toe activate free nerve endings in response to the noxious stimulus. The signal enters the dorsal horn and synapses with second-order neurons that travel along these three tracks. In the spinomesencephalic tract, the signal extends to the superior colliculus and the PAG in the midbrain. This helps orient the eyes and head toward the injury and activates descending pain inhibition systems. The spinoreticulator tract projects to the reticular formation in the brainstem, contributing to arousal, attention, and the general alert response to pain. The spinolimbic tract reaches areas like the amygdala, insula, and anterior cingulate cortex, creating the emotional aspect of pain such as distress, fear, or anger. These pathways use glutamate and substance P as their spinal synapses, and they produce information at the spinal cord. They process information at the spinal cord, brainstem, and limbic system. Only the spinolimbic pathway reaches conscious perception, but the pain is diffuse and poorly localized. Overall, the divergent pathways helps the body to remember this danger for next time to prevent similar injuries.
The spinocerebellar tracts carry non-conscious proprioceptive information from the muscles and joints to the cerebellum, helping to maintain posture, balance, and coordinated movement. Signals originate in receptors like muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors. These receptors detect changes in stretch, tension, and joint position and send signals into the spinal cord via large diameter afferent fibers, specifically group 1A, 1B, and 2 fibers. The posterior spinobellar tract and anterior spinobellar tract both carry information from the lower limb, but the anterior spinocerebellar tract picks up more integrated information, combining both sensory feedback and descending motor commands. Its neurons arise from the interneurons in the lateral gray matter of the spinal cord. Both the posterior and anterior spinocerebellar tracts enter the spinal cord through the dorsal roots, but they take different paths to the cerebellum. The posterior tract has its first synapse in Clark's nucleus located between T1 and L2 in the spinal cord. From there, it ascends ipsilaterally. The anterior tract decussates twice. First, it crosses over the in the spinal cord at the level of origin and then ascends ipsilaterally until it reaches the pons, where it decussates again, entering the ipsilateral cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle. The posterior cerebellar tract enters the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The double crossing of the anterior cerebellar tract means that, like the posterior tract, it delivers information to the same side of the cerebellum from which it originated. At each of these spinal cord synapses, like those in Clark's nucleus or the anterior interneurons, the primary neurotransmitter involved is glutamate, which helps transmit these excitatory signals rapidly to the cerebellum. These tracts do not project to the cortex, so we do not consciously feel or perceive their input, but instead they feed directly into the spinocerebellum, helping the body adjust and coordinate movements like shifting weight or correcting balance when reacting to painful stimulus.
Now we're going to move on to the autonomic nervous system component. When it comes to central processing, the flow of information starts with the emotion system, then goes to the hypothalamus, then reticular formation, and ends in the spinal cord. So, in our case, from start to finish, the pain signal starts in the toe, travels through the spinal cord to the brain, specifically the hypothalamus, and then the brain activates the sympathetic autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system sends signals back down to the organs and blood vessels, both near the toe and throughout the body, to respond to the injury. So how will input from the autonomic nervous system impact the movement of the great toe? The autonomic nervous system doesn't directly control voluntary muscle movement like wiggling your toe. That's the job of the somatic nervous system. However, the autonomic nervous system plays a supporting role. When the toe is injured, the autonomic nervous system can affect blood flow, swelling, and inflammation in the area. For instance, sympathetic nervous activity may initially cause vasoconstriction, which is a narrowing of the blood vessels. Later, as the body works to heal, the parasympathetic system may promote vasodilation, increasing blood flow and aiding to tissue repair. So while the autonomic nervous system doesn't move the toe, it does impact the environment around the muscles and the tissues that do. Now, how does the sensory information arising in the great toe impact the autonomic nervous system? Pain signals from the crushed toe travel to the spinal cord and brain, where they can trigger a sympathetic nervous system response. This is often called the flight or fight reaction. The result may include increased heart rate, blood pressure, and a release of stress hormones like adrenaline. All this happens because the autonomic nervous system is preparing the body to respond to injury and potential danger. So a stepped-on toe doesn't just hurt, it kicks off a whole body stress response. Now, what pathway does the information travel in the autonomic nervous system? The sensory information from the injured toe travels via the afferent sensory neurons to the spinal cord, entering through the dorsal root. From there, the pain signal is relayed to the brain in response to the hypothalamus, which is one of the key control centers of the autonomic nervous system. It activates the sympathetic nervous system, and then efferent autonomic signals then travel down the spinal cord, exit through the thoracolumbar region, and synapse in the sympathetic ganglia before reaching target organs like the heart, blood vessels, and adrenal glands. This whole pathway allows the body to react quickly and appropriately to pain and injury.
Once sensory information reaches the brain, the body instinctively reacts to the injury by pulling the leg towards the trunk. This reflex is carried out by the motor tracts. Meanwhile, the sensory signals are produced and refined in areas like the cerebellum and basal ganglia. These structures help fine-tune the response by sending feedback to the descending motor tracts, adjusting the signal based on the body's needs. After this modulation, the motor tracts carry the final instructions down to their common endpoint, the end effector organ, being the skeletal muscles, which carry out the movement. The first and primary motor pathway involved is the reticulospinal tract. Originating in the reticular formation of the midbrain and pons, it travels ipsilaterally through both the upper and lower medulla before synapsing with lower motor neurons in the cervical and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. This tract is responsible for gross limb movements, particularly in the lower extremities in this context. It synapses at spinal cord levels L1, L2, L4, and S2, helping to produce hip flexion knee flexion, and ankle dorsiflexion. Additionally, it plays a role in anticipatory postural adjustments, for example, by activating contralateral hip muscles to improve stability through co-contraction. To produce this movement, certain muscles must be activated while others need to be inhibited to allow smooth, coordinated motion. For activation, the iliopsoas and rectus femoris engage to produce hip flexion. The biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus activate to create knee flexion. The tibialis anterior fires to produce ankle dorsiflexion, and on the contralateral side, the gluteus maximus, gluteus medius, and erector spinae contract to enhance postural stability. For inhibition, the gluteus maximus and proximal hamstrings must relax to allow hip flexion. The vastus medialis, intermedius, lateralis, and rectus femoris are inhibited to permit knee flexion. The gastrocnemius, soleus, and tibialis posterior are suppressed to enable ankle dorsiflexion. The next important motor pathway is the vestibulospinal tract, which includes two components, the medial and lateral vestibulospinal tracts. The medial vestibulospinal tract originates in the medial vestibular nucleus in the upper medulla and travels bilaterally through the medulla before synapsing with lower motor neurons in the cervical spinal cord. This tract controls muscles in the neck and upper back, allowing for head and neck movements such as turning to look at the injured great toe. The lateral vestibulospinal tract arises from the lateral vestibular nucleus, also located in the upper medulla, and travels ipsilaterally through the spinal cord to synapse with lower motor neurons in the thoracic and lumbar regions. Its primary role is to help maintain balance by keeping the center of gravity aligned over the base of support. To do this, it activates postural muscles in the thoracic spine at levels T1 through T12 and lumbar spine levels L1 through L5, enabling the body to shift the base of support laterally in preparation for single leg stance. The final pathway is the medial corticospinal tract. It begins in the primary motor cortex and descends through the internal capsule and anterior brainstem before continuing down through the cervical and thoracic spinal cord, where it synapses with lower motor neurons at various levels. This tract primarily controls the muscles of the neck, shoulders, and trunk, working alongside other pathways to coordinate and stabilize posture.